Hi you guys, I am standing in kind of a noisy spot, but I am standing in the first official city in Grays Harbor. And maybe you've been here before. It's Cosmopolis. How many of you have driven past this spot in Cosmopolis and never really paid much attention to it? I know I did for a while, but it's actually a really important site of a big historical event. And there is a mural here and a plaque that explains. It's the Cosmopolis Treaty grounds. Governor Isaac Stevens came here to negotiate treaties with some of the coastal tribes. And so this plaque explains it. Now, Governor Stevens came and he met with the upper and lower Chehalis tribes, which also includes Shoalwater Bay, the lower Chinook, the Cowlitz, and the Quinault. And this plaque commemorates it. But this plaque leaves out a lot of the story, so I'm going to explain more of it to you. So I am standing right next to the Chehalis River in Cosmopolis. And down this river came all the people who met with Governor Isaac Stevens. They all arrived in canoes. And it was this exact same time of year. So it's cold, at times wet, and it's winter. And Stevens brought a gift for the tribes, and he brought them a gift of potatoes. And he had a giant pile of potatoes that were kind of a help yourself, first come, first serve kind of pile of potatoes to take with them. And many people were eating them at the time that they camped out here. They camped out here from February 20th to March 2nd of 1855. This land was owned by a man named James Pilkington, and he had this area cleared a little bit so that they could set up camp to meet with the tribes. 20 canoe loads of Native Americans showed up. And so imagine those canoes on this river. One man named James Swan wrote about the account of the arrival of them. And he said it was very cold and damp that morning, and without waiting for breakfast, they arrived early that morning here. And here's what he said. But the Indians did not seem to mind the cold at all, for excited with the desire to outvie each other in their attempts to be first to camp, they paddled and screamed and shouted and laughed and cut up all kinds of antics which served to keep them aglow. As we approached the camp, we all stopped at a bend in the river, about 3/4 of a mile distant, when all began to wash their faces, comb their hair, and put on their best clothes. The women got out their bright shawls and dresses and painted their faces with vermilion, or red ochre, and grease, and decked themselves out with their beads and trinkets, and in about 10 minutes were a gay-looking set, and certainly the appearance of the canoes filled with Indians dressed in their brightest colors was very picturesque. But I should have enjoyed it better had the weather been a little warmer, which I can understand as I'm standing here. It's very cold out. So this is where everyone set up camp. And after all the excitement of their arrival, it was time for the tribal councils and Stevens and his men to get down to business and negotiate with the treaties. Each tribe had an interpreter, and Stevens's interpreter spoke to them in Chinook jargon. Now, as you may remember, that was a trade language, and it only had about 700 words, which most spoken languages have at least 15,000 words. Plus, the information was going between English to Chinook jargon to an interpreter that spoke the language to the tribal council of that tribe, and then reverse it. So, as you can imagine, things got lost in translation. This is not good considering the importance of what they were doing. Governor Stevens wanted their land and wanted them to move to a reservation. So what were the terms of Stevens' treaty? He told the tribes, 1, you will all move to one reservation together. 2, the Great Father, or also known as the President, and it was President Franklin Pierce at that time, will decide where you will go. Number 3, I will give $40,000 per tribe, paid out in installments of a few $1,000s per year. And number 4, you'll get supplies, a doctor, and a school on the reservation. The tribal council members had one wish. They wanted to stay in their own areas near the fishing and burial grounds of their ancestors. Stevens would acknowledge their wishes during the negotiations, but kept repeating that he'd pass on the request to the president and he'd decide the best place for them to go. The Chinook, Chehalis, and Cowlitz tribes did not want to go to a reservation on the coast. They were from inland, and they understandably didn't want to leave their homelands. Discussion started to break down at this Chehalis River Treaty because Stevens wanted the tribes to agree to move without telling them the specific location. He just said somewhere between the northern tip of the Washington Peninsula and Grays Harbor. The 4 treaties before that were told the specific size and location. Stevens said they were to leave it up to the Great Father. When some of the tribes found out they'd been placed with enemy tribes, that caused a lot of anger as well. The leader of the Chehalis tribe, Chief Tuleuk, grew frustrated and angry with the lack of negotiation. He made a scene in the evening after some of the negotiations and worked to get other tribes on his side. The next day, when Stevens found out he couldn't have his way because tribes wouldn't sign until they had some of their requests met, he abruptly broke up the council and dramatically ripped up the treaty. He announced that no treaty had been made and none would be made, and that was the end of the Chehalis River Treaty in Cosmopolis. So, how does the story end? Only the Quinault were prepared to sign the treaty under the conditions Stevens gave, and understandably so, because the reservation land was closest to their home. Later, Stevens made a separate treaty with the Quinault and Quileutes at the Treaty of Olympia. The Chinook were never federally recognized and are still fighting for recognition to this very day. The Chehalis, they kept losing land to white settlers anyway, and eventually got a treaty signed and a reservation land almost 10 years later in 1864. One big promise that was protected for the tribes was the rights to fishing, hunting, and gathering in all the accustomed locations, which included off the reservation. They gave up their rights to land permanently, but kept this very important right, which is also permanent and is still in effect today. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you learned something.